According to rumours, the Russians today, Tuesday, 4th June, are considering taking a more aggressive action in the Black Sea to counter US and NATO surveillance drones and aircraft. Apparently, this is going to be, if it happens, a response to the decision by the United States and the other NATO countries to authorize cross-border strikes by Ukraine into Russia using American weapons. Now, I want to stress that for the moment, this is only speculation, or to be more precise, rumor. If it happens, it will be a major counter-escalation by the Russians, though no more so, by the way, than the American decision to authorize Ukraine to launch attacks on Russian territory using American weapons, American-supplied weapons. But as I say, we will see whether or not that decision is indeed going to be made by the Russians. My own guess, by the way, is that if it is what the Russians do intend to do, then there is a real possibility that they won't formally declare it, and that instead of formally announcing it and taking measures to shoot down US drones and NATO aircraft, which would be very escalatory indeed and might oblige the United States to start taking counter-action. What the Russians are more likely to do is to increase jamming of these drones and these aircraft to a far greater extent than has been the case up to this time. I say that because my understanding is that the Russians have not been jamming these drones and aircraft to any particular degree up to this time. Jamming, of course, of the radars is certainly possible, I understand, from a technological point of view. I understand that in many cases they are ASA radars, which are said to be immune to jamming. We have seen over the course of this war that systems that are supposed to be immune to jamming are not immune to jamming. And I suspect that the Russians, by this point in the war, have probably developed techniques to do that. But anyway, to repeat again, this is all for the moment rumor and speculation. It's been discussed extensively in Russia, but there's been no official statement. We will see what happens. And, well, if there is no public announcement, we might only know about it from the movement of aircraft and from any public responses from the United States and from the NATO countries. Well, that then segues into the actual situation on the front lines. And I'm going to start with what's going on in Kharkov region, because, of course, this is where Ukraine was allowed to conduct its military strikes against Russia as a result of that decision by the United States and by the NATO powers that took place several days ago. And before I discuss that, I would like again to reiterate, to repeat my own agreement with what was said by Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis in a live stream that we did with him on the Duran yesterday, which is that I think it is most unlikely that Britain and France will enable Ukraine to conduct missile strikes on Russia using Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles when the United States has refused to permit ATACMS missile strikes to be conducted from Ukrainian territory against Russia. I think that the British and the French are not prepared to go where the Americans fear to tread. I've never seen them do so at any point in any of the various conflicts that have taken place over the last 30 years. And I don't think the British and the French would be prepared to go behind a decision of the United States and undermine it in that sort of way and put themselves at enormous risk of Russian retaliation at a time when the United States has not agreed to that in advance and might not be happy to help the British and French out of any problems that they find themselves in. And by the way, there is an article today in the New York Times which speaks about the unease within the Biden administration at the decision that has just been made, and the fact that the United States, notwithstanding all the brave talk, still is very anxious to avoid becoming drawn into an open-ended conflict with Russia, a nuclear superpower, and that the United States is unlikely to expand the remit of what President Zelensky wants the United States to do. It is, in other words, unlikely to want to enlarge the missile strikes, for the moment at least, to expand and to take in more territory and more targets within Russia. And if you read the article in the New York Times carefully, one gets the sense that some people in Washington are gradually coming to the conclusion that Ukraine is becoming an increasingly difficult and over-demanding ally, and that the US, at least again, some people in Washington, are starting to worry that the United States might have become overcommitted to a particular ally over which it has little apparent control. Now, I say all of that, let me stress again that there are undoubtedly other people within the administration and the wider US government who take a completely different view. I would regard this article in the New York Times not as the final word on this issue, but more as an expression of the unending conflict that goes on between the various factions in Washington, in which up to this point in time, the hardliners, those who want to push furthest, have always been in the ascendant. But anyway, it is an interesting article. One should perhaps file it away. We'll see when the next escalation comes, because sooner or later, I'm sure that it will. But anyway, we'll also see whether there is indeed this Russian counter-escalation that we're talking about, and that will perhaps only become apparent over the next few weeks if, as I suspect, the Russians decide to do this without making a formal announcement. Now, I'm going to make one further observation. If American strikes are indeed, or at least strikes by Ukraine, I should say, with American weapons, are indeed limited to the area of the border, and the Russians are able and start successfully jamming American and NATO surveillance aircraft over the Black Sea, and if no further escalation happens, well, then in that case, Ukraine will have suffered a significantly bigger loss from this affair than anything it has achieved. Because it's absolutely clear to me that Ukrainian missile and drone strikes on Crimea and on Russian Navy ships and other targets in the Black Sea are only possible because of the data Ukraine has been receiving from these Western surveillance aircraft. If that data is no longer being provided, then the whole project to strike at Crimea and at the Navy targets, the Russian Navy targets, effectively ends. In which case, for very little practical gain, in fact, in my opinion, for no effective practical gain, Ukraine will have lost the opportunity to conduct the kind of strikes on the Black Sea, in the Black Sea and in Crimea, which at least provide Ukraine with PR successes, if not perhaps very real ones. So we'll see what happens. This is probably, as I said, going to become clear only over the course of time. We need to keep an eye out on what is discussed and spoken about in the Russian media. Also, if we start to see a withdrawal of Western assets, drones and other aircraft from the Black Sea area, we will know that there has been some change. But anyway, for the moment, it's all rumour and speculation, and we'll see where it goes. But let's now turn to the situation on the front lines. And I'm tempted to say that it is more of the same. That's not actually completely true. Firstly, the Russian group of forces, the Sever group of forces that is conducting the operation in the Kharkov area, has provided us with some information. I understand it comes from its website about the general situation in the Volchansk area in Kharkov region. And I'll read it out. On June 3rd, the Sever group of troops continued the liberation of the border areas of Kharkov region. Liberation, by the way, is a very interesting choice of words. It strongly suggests, at least to me, that any territory in Kharkov region that the Russians capture over the next couple of weeks as the Kharkov operation continues, they do not intend to withdraw from. Now, Kharkov region was part of the territory of historic Russia. I understand that Russian is the language that is spoken throughout this area, including in Kharkov city. The Russians probably regard all these areas as ultimately Russian. In 2022, they took a decision to withdraw from Kharkov region, basically because they did not have enough troops to maintain control there. But this time, when their forces are far more powerful, it looks as if they intend to stay. And that is something that perhaps Ukraine itself and its Western sponsors need to keep in mind. Just saying. Let's now return to the report itself. As I said, this comes from the Sever group of forces, and this is what it says. In the Volchansk direction, fierce fighting continues in the Volchansk settlement. In the city centre, assault units continue to cover the area of high-rise buildings. And this is the area which some people are referring to as the Citadel. This is where the Ukrainian troops in Volchansk appear to be, or at least in Volchansk north of the Volcha River, appear to be mostly concentrated. As I have discussed, I believe that these troops are effectively cut off from resupply from the Ukrainian forces south of the Volcha River, but we will come to that in a short time. Anyway, the Russians, the North group of forces, then acknowledge difficulties. The advance of the Russian troops in this area, the high-rise buildings, is significantly hampered by enemy sniper groups. TOS crews are working effectively against them. So the Russians are deploying their terrifying TOS-1 and TOS-2 multiple launch rocket systems which fire thermobaric tipped warheads which cause these huge explosions and flames. I believe that it's one of the most terrifying weapons in the conflict, and I believe that it's one that the Ukrainians themselves are particularly frightened of. And anyway, they're being deployed apparently to the Citadel area. These will almost certainly be the tracked TOS-1 systems. By the way, there's a new TOS system called the TOS-3, also tracked, and apparently it will be entering service fairly soon, but it's almost certainly not yet in service on the battlefronts. So the Russians still having problems reducing this area, the Citadel area, in Volchansk. There's snipers apparently on the high-rise buildings. That makes advances into this area difficult, but the Russians are now going to deploy their TOS machines to try to, literally smoke out these snipers so that they can advance into this area. And then the North group of forces, the Sever group of forces, then goes on to say this: the total advance of Russian troops in the Volchansk direction amounted to 390 meters. Significant advances are recorded in the east of the city. In the morning, the enemy, that means obviously the Ukrainians, unsuccessfully counterattacked and put down up to 2 platoons of the elite 82nd Airborne Assault Brigade. So, according to the Russians, according to the Sever group of forces, in the eastern part of northern Volchansk, this is the area north of the Volcha River, the Ukrainians attempted a counterattack. The counterattack failed. The Ukrainians were driven back, and the Russians then were able to follow the successful defeat of the counterattack by advancing a further 390 meters, which is a significant amount of territory in a built-up area. Now, is this actually true? I say this because there have been lots of reports over the last couple of days about Ukrainian counterattacks, successful Ukrainian counterattacks in the Volchansk and Lipsy areas. Yesterday, the Ukrainians released the first picture, which appeared to show a Russian soldier surrendering near a building in this area where the Russians claim that they made this advance of 390 meters, and the Ukrainians are citing this as proof that there not only was a counterattack, but it was successful. I am going to say straight away that I think it is unlikely that the Sever group of forces would provide straightforwardly false information about the situation. It is not consistent with the reporting practices of the Russian military over the course of this war. So I'm going to go with this account. I think most likely there was a counterattack. In fact, there was clearly a Ukrainian counterattack. The Ukrainians did push into Russian-controlled territory. There was a short fight near a particular building. A Russian soldier did surrender. The Russians then counterattacked, drove the Ukrainians back, and gained new ground. And that, I think, summarizes the situation in northern Volchansk. The Russians running into problems capturing the Citadel area, the area of the high-rises, but successfully repelling counterattacks. Now, there have been many pictures of Russian missile and bomb attacks on various bridges along the Volcha River. And there's also been many pictures of the Ukrainians trying to rebuild pontoon bridges across the Volcha River, trying to restore the bridges. There's a lot of Ukrainian engineering equipment apparently in the area, and we have pictures from the Russians of attempts by the Ukrainians to restore the bridges and of the Russians destroying the bridges when they have been rebuilt. And some are treating this as evidence that the Russians have not successfully cut off the Ukrainian troops in northern Volchansk. I am not sure I understand that. I would have thought that it was much easier to destroy a bridge using a rocket or a bomb than it was to rebuild it. I've seen a report that it takes roughly 20 days for the Ukrainians to restore a bridge, whereas almost by definition, it's only going to take the Russians a few hours to destroy the same bridge. So what I'm guessing is happening is that the Ukrainians, desperately trying to get reinforcements and supplies to their cut-off troops in northern Volchansk, are trying to repair the bridges, but as soon as the bridges are repaired, the Russians destroy them. And that must be reducing supplies that are getting through to the Ukrainian troops in northern Volchansk to a trickle. Of course, the Volcha River is not an enormous river. We're not talking about the Dnieper or even the Oskol, though the Oskol can, it seems to me, be waded in some places in midsummer. But so it's possible that Ukrainian infantry can cross the Volcha River and to some extent reinforce Ukrainian troops in Volchansk. And no doubt that is happening to some extent. But in order to keep troops fighting, they obviously need supplies of ammunition, of food, of water, of all kinds of things, medical supplies as well. And I suspect that it is these supplies which are probably not getting through. Anyway, that's the situation according to the Sever group of what is happening in northern Volchansk. They also provide some information about the situation in Lipsy. They say in the Lipsy area, the Sever forces have entrenched themselves in the forest belt southeast of Glubokoye and have repulsed one counterattack by the Ukrainian military using up to 30 troops. The enemy lost about 7 personnel. And the North group of forces then goes on to say that over the past day, enemy losses amounted to 310 troops, and there was also a T-64 tank was destroyed, an OSA anti-aircraft missile system, Soviet-era anti-aircraft missile system, was destroyed, a bridge-laying vehicle was destroyed, an M-triple howitzer, 2 drones, and various other pieces of equipment. And we are also getting reports that Ukraine is now finalizing the transfer of its remaining reserves to Kharkov region. And there's speculation, various speculation, that the Ukrainians are going to try to use these troops to conduct another counter-offensive. Now, we have heard lots of reports over the last couple of days about Ukrainian counterattacks and counter-offensives in the Kharkov area. And there have also been claims that the Ukrainians outnumber the Russians by something like 3-1 in manpower in the Kharkov area. I find that latter claim, by the way, most unlikely. Supposedly there's 7 brigades of Ukrainian troops in this area, plus a scattering, or at least the equivalent of 7 brigades of Ukrainian troops in this area. Some of these so-called brigades are really amalgams of brigades made up of battalions drawn from various other brigades along the combat line who have had to give up a battalion to reinforce the Ukrainian forces in Kharkov region. But anyway, 7 brigade equivalents plus a scattering of other forces making up the group that Ukraine has concentrated in Kharkov region. Now, in a recent program, I speculated that a Ukrainian brigade might number 4,000 men, and that with 7 brigade equivalents, that would be a force of around 30,000 men in total. If we added all the other forces, put them all together, then it would be more like perhaps 40,000 in total, which probably would outnumber the Russian forces in this area, said to number now around 25,000, though not by a factor of 3 to 1. Having said that, a number of people have come back to me and have said that I'm wildly overestimating the typical strength of a Ukrainian brigade. A full-strength brigade would normally number around 2,000 men, and of course we have been told that Ukrainian brigades are now operating at 40% strength. But since we're talking about brigade equivalents rather than brigade actual brigades, let's go with the 2,000 men per brigade equivalent figure. 7 brigades, 2,000 men each, that would give us a figure of around 14,000 Ukrainian troops in these units, plus, as I said, the scattering of the others. Let's assume there's another 10,000 of those. That gives us a force of around 25,000 men, which is about the same number as the forces that the Russians have in this area. And that presumably explains why these Ukrainian counterattacks have been unsuccessful. It's clear that the Ukrainians are heavily outgunned by the Russians in this area. We'll come to the missile strikes that the Ukrainians have been launching on Russian positions within Russia shortly. But it's clear that the Ukrainians are heavily outgunned. They have no presence to speak of in the air, except for FPV drones. But the Russians have an overwhelming superiority in artillery, and of course they can bomb Ukrainian positions at will. So, for the moment at least, the two sides are evenly matched in terms of numbers, but the Ukrainians, because they have such a significant force in the area, probably have enough for the moment to prevent further Russian advances, or at least to slow down Russian operations in places like Volchansk and Lipsy, though we see that the Sever group of forces appears to believe that in Lipsy at least the Russians continue to make continued progress, and as I said, I think that is probably true. Anyway, this is an unstable equilibrium that has been established on the border. The Ukrainians have rushed reinforcements there, as I said, say 20 to 25,000 men. They've contained the Russians for the moment. They're sending what remaining reserves they have. That's what the Sever group of forces are telling us. In other words, they're deploying pretty much everything that they have left. But the Russians, it's clear, are doing the same. They are also deploying reserves, only, unlike the Ukrainians, they have multiples more left. And there's constant pictures and films of troop trains moving to the Kharkov area within Russia with heavy tanks and armor and all of that. And that suggests major Russian deployments are indeed taking place in the Kharkov and perhaps Sumy border areas in preparation for another big Russian advance. Now, I say all of that to reiterate again, up to this time, all Russian attacks in the Kharkov area, in Lipsy, in Volchansk, and the villages that the Russians have captured along the border have been carried out by motorized infantry. In other words, light infantry, not mechanized, heavy mechanized infantry, equipped with tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, but light infantry on wheels, armoured personnel carriers, but backed obviously by heavy artillery and drones, and supported to an overwhelming extent by the Russian Air Force. The Russians have broken through to Lipsy and Volchansk. They seem to be parked outside Lipsy, repelling Ukrainian counterattacks. They continue to advance in Volchansk. They're gradually introducing some armoured units into the Lipsy and Volchansk areas, but it's probably the case that the big, heavy blow has still not fallen. And I think the reason for that is that the Russians, firstly, want the Ukrainians to concentrate their remaining reserves to this area, which appears to be happening, and they also want to continue to destroy the Ukrainian artillery systems that are based in this area as well. And with every single day, there are reports of the mass destruction of Ukrainian artillery in the Kharkov area, a process carried out principally by Lancet drones, a destruction which still continues. So, it's likely that we have an unstable equilibrium, and it's likely, well, this is at least my assessment of the situation. As I said, others might disagree, and of course it could easily turn out otherwise. But my assessment of the situation is that we now have an unstable equilibrium, one which will be followed up at some point over the next few weeks with a much, much heavier punch when the armoured infantry in the tanks and the infantry fighting vehicles is finally committed to the battle. What the Russians then intend to do, how far they intend to go, I have absolutely no idea. Putin said that the Russians have no plans to capture Kharkov city for now. Maybe they are developing those plans even as we speak. Maybe they're planning to advance in a completely different direction, perhaps towards Kiev. I'm not going to try to guess. But anyway, that seems to me the situation in Kharkov region at the present time. Now, one thing I do want to say about the Russian forces, there has been apparently, and it's been widely circulating, and it was picked up by Dima at the Military Summary Channel, an assessment of the fighting in Kharkov region by a Ukrainian soldier. He had a pessimistic take on the fighting in Kharkov region overall. And one of the points that he made was that the Ukrainians in this area, unlike in other places on the conflict line, are fighting the regular Russian army. Now, I've made this point many times that in many places along the conflict line, and to a very great extent until relatively recently, most of the troops that we have seen are either newly formed regiments and divisions created by the Russians on the basis of the Donbass, the former Donbass militia, or special forces troops, or paratroop and marine brigades, or forces made up of irregular formations like the various military, private military companies, and of course the Akhmat Chechen forces. We have increasingly seen over the last couple of months regular Russian units participating in the fighting along the conflict line. The percentage of these regular forces is gradually growing as the Russians feed in more of their reserves. But I think the Ukrainian soldier is right that Kharkov region is unusual in that the only troops that are operating in this area on the Russian side are indeed regular Russian troops drawn from the regular Russian army, specifically from the units of the Leningrad military district. And the Ukrainian soldier talks of these troops being conscripts, which is what the Ukrainians always say about regular Russian military formations. I don't believe that this is the case at all. They are, I'm sure that they are soldiers fighting on a contract basis or as volunteers. Many soldiers in the regular Russian army are now recruited in that way. I think that the policy still is to keep conscripts out of the battlefronts. And I think people should not be confused by this. I've noticed that some people are. The key point is that these are regular Russian army units, and we're likely to see many more of them, not just in Kharkov region, but right across the conflict line over the next few months. And these will be the heavy infantry in the infantry fighting vehicles operating alongside the tanks. And that, I suspect, when it happens, probably in the summer, will mark another important sea change in the course of the war. Now, what about the Ukrainian missile strikes that we've been hearing so much about in the Kharkov region with the HIMARS and all of the rest? Well, the Ukrainians have made some very bold claims. They claim to have destroyed a warehouse which stocked Iskander-M missiles. They claim to have destroyed another S-400 air defense system, again in this area close to Belgorod. They provided smudgy photos of the destruction of the S-400, which I myself find impossible to make any sense of. And we've now reached that point in the war where I would not be surprised if photographs are being retouched and reproduced, showing events from earlier battles. There was, by the way, a curious case where an aircraft was... There was a picture shown of an aircraft that was apparently falling from the sky. It was said that it was a Russian Sukhoi 35 shot down by the Ukrainians, and apparently it was a heavily retouched photograph of an American F-15 that apparently crashed some years ago. I'm not going to get into the details of this sort of thing because photographic analysis, as I've explained many times, is absolutely not my thing. But anyway, the Ukrainians have made various bold claims, but I have to say, I see no difference at all in what is happening on the actual battlefronts. I doubt that these Ukrainian missile and artillery strikes on Russian positions inside Russia have made any significant difference to the extent that they use American weapons. It's the case that the Ukrainians have been carrying out such cross-border strikes anyway for a very long time now. To the extent that there is any real enhancement in Ukrainian capabilities, it is that the Ukrainians may be getting targeting data from the Americans and the British and the French, but then I think they've been receiving that targeting data about locations to attack in Russia all along. I don't think there's anything new there either. Anyway, that's the events in Kharkov region. An unstable equilibrium, probably another big Russian attack coming. The build-up on the border with these troop trains moving towards the border strongly suggests it. Probably it's several weeks away, though who knows, I might be wrong, and we will get a sense at some point of what will happen when that major strike comes. But I think that the Russians, as always, are following their usual course in this area. As in all others, they're conducting aggressive attrition. They are causing the Ukrainians to commit more and more of their precious reserves to this area of the battle line, and the Ukrainian forces are being depleted, and their artillery stockpile is depleted, both ammunition and artillery guns, and that means that when the armoured fist hits, it will hit against a much depleted and much weakened Ukrainian force, and then we will see what it is exactly that the Russians intend to do. Now, there was an interesting piece in the from the Russians about the military situation, and there was a claim that the Russians, that the Ukrainians are now running very, very short of M777 howitzers. And this comes from a Russian artillery commander called Kovorka. He is talking to TASS from Battle Group East, and he says 150 millimeter guns, 3 axes, he means triple M777 howitzers, fire in response, but very few of them have remained, and the Ukrainian troops, do not place them at firing positions because we destroy them. And he goes on to say, strike drones remain the most widespread method of counter-battery warfare in the Ukrainian army. That is to say, FPV drones. And so it is perhaps a telltale sign that these heavy losses by Ukraine of its artillery arsenal, that it's beginning to have an effect. It's starting to wear down the number of artillery pieces that the Ukrainians actually have, and that overall the Ukrainians might be starting to run short of artillery pieces, and specifically of M777 howitzers. And as I've been making this program, I noticed that one Russian official, Vitaly Ganchev, who was speaking to Russia's Channel 1 program, he's also spoken about the fighting in Kharkov region, And he's now talking. I noticed that he uses the expression Kharkov meat grinder to describe what is happening. He is, in effect, in other words, confirming that that attrition is what the Russians are engaged in. He says that the advance, this means the Russian advance, continues, even if it has slowed down now. The Kiev regime is trying to throw as many forces as possible into this Kharkov meat grinder in the northern part of the region, and also in the eastern part where they are losing their positions. They are mobilizing human resources in the city, he means Kharkov city, and in the region, and immediately throwing unprepared personnel into the frontline area. Hence the result, the amount of the reserves that they have brought in to halt the movement of our armed forces is large enough, but untrained, mobilized soldiers make up the greater part of it. And Ganshev has also told TASS that the Russians have liberated about half of Volchansk, which might be an overestimate, by the way. Anyway, Operation Kharkov meat grinder. It looks like that is now also underway. Preparatory, as I said, for the next big Russian advance. What is going on elsewhere on the front lines? Well, we've had less news from Chasiv Yar, where the Russians are presumably currently consolidating their breakthroughs, the ones that they achieved over the last couple of days. There's been more reports that Kalinina, the village to the northwest of Chasiv Yar, has now been fully captured by the Russians. There seems to be little doubt any longer that the Russians are indeed entrenched west of the aqueduct, both on the northern and southern flanks of Chasiv Yar. The fighting in the micro-district east of the aqueduct continues with horrific levels of intensity. But as I think I said yesterday, some reports suggest that the Russians might control somewhere around 30 to 40% of it. One way or the other, the outcome there is not in doubt. There have apparently been more reports of further Russian advances, big Russian advances in the Ocheretino and Avdeevka areas. And I've seen reports that Novo-Alexandrovka, northwest of Ocheretino, is about to fall. By the way, if that is true, then that is a disaster for the Ukrainians, almost on the scale as the fall of Ocheretino itself. It would mean that the Russians are indeed coming dangerously close to the Ukrainian supply bases in Pokrovsk and elsewhere, and are coming very close to cutting off all the various roads. There is also film, apparently, which confirms that the Russians are gradually eating away at what's left of the remaining part of Krasnogorovka, which the Ukrainians still to some extent control. And further south still, there are multiple claims, including apparently from Ukrainian sources, though not yet the 79th Brigade, which is defending in this area, that the village of Paraskovievka has now fallen fully under Russian control, which opens the way for the Russians to attack the next bigger village, Konstantinovka, immediately to the west. If Konstantinovka falls, the Russians are astride one of the main supply lines to Vuhledar and are again approaching further Kurakovo, further west, which is the main logistical hub for the Ukrainians, keeping Vuhledar supplied. Now, I suspect, as I discussed yesterday in my program, that the Russians are conducting these operations, as they say, rhythmically. Perhaps they're waiting to take Konstantinovka in this area before they complete the battle for Krasnogorovka and for Maximiliovka and the village to the west of Georgievka, which they've also reached, so that they can simultaneously advance on Kharkov from several directions, cutting the road leading to that town, that important town. But that we might be coming increasingly close to the point when that kind of attack might actually take place, might be suggested by a statement that's apparently circulating and which does appear to have its source within the Russian military, that the battle for Vuhledar itself is about to begin, which suggests that the Russians are now confident that before long the remaining supply lines to Vuhledar will be cut, that Vuhledar will be taken in what is, the Russians say, is some form of operational encirclement, at which point it's the position of the Ukrainian forces there will become desperate and bringing about eventually its ultimate fall. The capture of Vuhledar has been a major problem for the Russians. The only Russian general who, to my knowledge, has actually been cashiered over the course of this war has been cashiered for his failure to conduct a successful offensive against Vuhledar, and his wasteful mismanagement of his troops in the attack on Vuhledar, which caused them to suffer inordinately heavy losses. So the capture of Vuhledar would be an important symbolic victory for the Russians, but it would also be a very important tactical, strategic victory as well, because it would mean the final collapse of the entire Ukrainian position in southern Donbass. And in my opinion, if you look at the map, it would make impossible any idea of further Ukrainian advances towards the Black Sea and towards the Sea of Azov. It would, in other words, consolidate Russian defense lines in Zaporozhye and Kherson regions. And by the way, it would also open the way for a Russian advance towards Zaporozhye and Dnipro from the south, if that is indeed the plan that the Russians have. So, a very difficult situation for the Ukrainians. They've been caught up in Operation Kharkov meat grinder, at least that's what Ganshev is telling us, and as I said elsewhere, on the battle lines. The pressure continues and continues to increase. Now, there continue to be lots of denials about this whole situation. There's apparently an article, I haven't read it, but I believe it's in Foreign Affairs, which once again says that this isn't the right time to open negotiations with Vladimir Putin. It's always Vladimir Putin that we must open negotiations with. He apparently runs absolutely everything in Russia. He's the foreign minister, he's the defense minister, he commands every Russian military unit, he is the entire government, in other words, every single official and military officer and who appears to command or control anything at all in Russia, is simply a puppet whose strings are being pulled by Putin himself. I really think that it is extremely unsatisfactory deeply unhelpful that we have converted Putin into a metonym for the Russian government, and indeed all too often for Russia itself. But anyway, this article in Foreign Affairs says that it's too early to talk to Putin, to negotiate with him. Instead, we should be focused supposedly on building up the Ukrainians and helping the Ukrainians at some point to go back on the offensive, to launch their own counterattack. And it's been claimed that this article apparently says that over the next few weeks and months, the Ukrainians are likely to lose significant territory to the Russians. The ongoing Russian offensive against a weakened and depleted Ukrainian force is likely to gain a certain amount of territory. But if the Ukrainian army is built up to a certain level, then it can go back on the attack, recapture some of the ground that has been lost, and then, but not before, that will be the time to begin negotiations. I have to say, I find this whole line of argument completely fantastic. I understand the frustration some people feel at the fact that in these programs I do discuss at some length the battlefield situation in Ukraine. But I think one has to do that, given that one is talking about a war. Unless one actually knows what is going on the battlefield, or at least not knows, but at least has some idea based on facts of what is actually going on the battlefields, one cannot make informed assessments about the general situation and discuss practically what can be done based on them. And clearly, whoever it is who's written this Foreign Affairs article, assuming that I'm reproducing it correctly, has no idea about the true situation, about the fact that Ukraine, its army is exhausted, that the experienced fighters are either dead or wounded or absolutely exhausted after 2 years of fighting, that many of the men who are being thrown into the battle are poorly trained and unwilling to fight, that the overall state of Ukraine's economy and society is exhausted as well, that, as The Guardian told us, as Timothy Garton Ash told us in The Guardian, half the Ukrainian population now suffers from PTSD, that after the Russian strikes on the Ukrainian energy system, it is a certainty that Ukraine is going to be desperately short of electric power in advance of the winter. And remember, Ukraine is a country where sub-zero temperatures are standard in winter, that Ukraine is now short not just of shells, but of actual artillery pieces. The tanks are in relatively short supply, that the vaunted American weapons, the HIMARS, the small diameter bombs, the Excalibur shells are all being jammed by the Russians, that the Russians have been successfully shooting down large numbers of ATACMS missiles and of Storm Shadows and Scalps. All of that. And the idea that this can be reversed, that it can be turned round by more infusions of Western help so as to put Ukraine in a better position to begin negotiations after some imaginary offensive that is going to regain ground. I simply do not understand how, based on the actual situation, anybody can realistically suggest such a thing. My suspicion is that this article, the purpose of this article, is not actually to put Ukraine in a better position to conduct negotiations at some point in the future. Rather, it is to stop any talk of negotiations now at all. I think that the author, perhaps not consciously, really doesn't want to see negotiations. Viscerally, this author's instincts are against negotiations entirely. So he or she is saying that the negotiations need to be postponed to some future imaginary time. Anybody who is familiar with the last few months of the Second World War will know that this is exactly what the German leader of that time was apparently telling to his commanders. He too was assuring them that actually there would be negotiations eventually, but all that they needed to do was to secure some other big victory somewhere or other. And then, once Germany was put in a better position, that's when negotiations could begin. In reality, he probably didn't want negotiations at all. And of course, no negotiations happened. And instead, Germany was defeated and completely overrun. And I would not be surprised myself if the same outcome awaits Ukraine. Anyway, as I said, there continues to be very high levels of denial about the current situation and all of the various ideas that people are coming up with to turn it round ultimately remain schemes. There is considerable talk at the moment, for example, about the French instructors that are now heading to Ukraine. And many believe, probably rightly by the way, that these instructors are actually preparatory for President Macron's ultimate plan, which is to introduce ground troops, French ground troops, to the theatre. But, as various military people are now pointing out, deploying European troops into the theatre, into the Ukraine conflict, is not going to reverse the course of events. The Western European armies, the ones that matter, are in a terrible condition. The German army is severely depleted. There's been an astonishing article in the Daily Telegraph, which has been reproduced in various other places, in which a senior British military officer has been talking about the catastrophic condition of the British army. He says that the plan to build 138 Challenger 3 tanks, and as Brian Beletic correctly says, these are not actually going to be apparently fully rebuilt, new build tanks. They're going to be upgrades of the existing Challenger 2s. But anyway, 138 tanks, he says, is no more than would suffice for at most 2 weeks fighting against the Russians. Actually, it would probably be much less than this. The British military overall is in no condition to fight, and this officer made the striking admission that there is a catastrophic shortage of ammunition, and that this has arisen because everything, right down to the bottom of the barrel, has been sent to Ukraine. It's an interesting admission, not one you often see in the media in Britain. And that the priority now, therefore, is to replenish British ammunition stocks, which will take years. Now, I get the sense that the French army might be in a slightly better shape. France has sent less equipment to Ukraine than other European states have done. A matter of bitter criticism of the French. But overall, the French army still is in no condition to take on the Russians. And the French military themselves know this. And this whole project of deploying French troops to Ukraine is bitterly unpopular in France. The Washington Post actually has an article about this, which says that French support for this project, which is, by the way, publicly non-existent, will collapse the moment French troops return to France from Ukraine in coffins. So, all kinds of schemes, projects, proposals put together. Even the ATACMS missile strikes and the Storm Shadows, if they were launched against Russia, could not change the overall military picture. Again, in a live stream we did yesterday with him on the Duran, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis made the entirely correct point that Russia has launched massive missile strikes against Ukraine, pummeling Ukraine for day after day, for week after week, for month after month, for more than 2 years now. And that has not sufficed in and of itself to knock Ukraine out of the war. All of the cruise missile forces, the cruise missiles, in the entirety of the West stockpile of cruise missiles, Storm Shadows, Taurus missiles, ATACMS missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles, if we came to that, would be incapable of reproducing the kind of strike that the Russians have launched. Even in volume terms, the Russians have already launched more than twice as many cruise missiles against Ukraine than the United States' Tomahawk cruise missiles in its existing stockpile. And, of course, Russia is the biggest country in the world. Its industrial facilities, its military-industrial complex is colossal. Its air defense system is huge. Even if an operation like that were carried out, based on what we have seen missiles achieve in Ukraine, such a missile offensive against Russia would exhaust itself and would achieve nothing, except, of course, infuriate the Russians and provoke them into an overwhelming and terrifying reaction. There is nothing that can be done militarily to reverse the situation in Ukraine. The only way out for Ukraine, bar a willingness of the United States to intervene directly in the war, what the New York Times is telling us that the United States does not want to do, the only way out for Ukraine is negotiations. And yet, Foreign Affairs, this person in Foreign Affairs is telling us that this is not the time for negotiations. We've got to wait until some imaginary victory that Ukraine will one day achieve on the battlefronts in order to put Ukraine in a better position. As I said, this kind of thinking, which we've seen repeated time and again ever since the conflict began, and I'm not talking now about February 2022, I'm talking about February 2014, when the conflict actually began. This kind of thinking, this refusal to enter into real good faith negotiations with the Russians, all it is achieving is the destruction of Ukraine. And a Chinese military officer has apparently now come forward and has made exactly that point. And the officer in question, Major General Su Hui of the People's Liberation Army of China, is actually given some unsolicited advice to President Zelensky, with whom the Chinese are furious because of what he's been saying about China's decision not to participate in the so-called peace summit in Lucerne. And he's reported as saying this: I would like to advise Zelensky to think about the value of the lives of the Ukrainian people. Understand what he is fighting for. The President of the United States of America has made a statement which I find alarming, that he will support Ukraine in the war to the last Ukrainian. Now, I think that is actually a misrepresentation of what President Biden has actually said. I don't think President Biden has put it as starkly as that. But anyway, the Chinese general is perhaps putting what is, in truth, an accurate representation of what US policy is. But anyway, this is what General Su then goes on to say. If you fight to the last Ukrainian, what are the Ukrainian people fighting for? You have no one left. The US president is not fighting to the last American. He is selling Ukraine ammunition. Even if it is the last Ukrainian, he will sell ammunition. That's a terrible thing to do. Zelensky should think very hard about what this means for Ukraine and what it means for the world and what it means for Europe. Well, General Su, if his comments are being reported accurately, and I'm taking this, I should say, from a Russian source, but if his comments are being reported accurately, he's telling us the truth. It's obvious. And what he is advising Zelensky to do, which is to negotiate with the Russians, is what any responsible Ukrainian leader who really has the interests of his country and people at heart ought to be doing in this impossible situation. But President Zelensky apparently is doing other things. Now, this again comes from TASS, but I've no reason to doubt this. It's a quote from Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Mikhail Galuzin, and he says this. He says Zelensky and his Western friends, and the word friends is in quotation marks, personally called all leaders of the former Soviet states, the countries in the Commonwealth of Independent States, in a last-ditch attempt to beg them to take part in this get-together summit in Lucerne. No one agreed to this. And then Galuzin goes on to say that the summit has nothing to do with peace. It is a hasty attempt to create an anti-Russian coalition and to present Moscow with an ultimatum to make it appear that the world supports Zelensky's unimplementable peace formula. Such get-togethers do not contribute to a political settlement. Their holding is pointless and a priori doomed to failure. The so-called peace conference in Switzerland is nothing but a camouflaged continuation of the failed Copenhagen format. That's the one that Jake Sullivan launched in August 2023 to promote Zelensky's stalemate formula. During the meetings of this format in 2023 and 2024, this is all from Gazulin, in Jeddah, Valletta and Davos, Kiev and its Western curators actively tried to lure representatives of the global South and East to join them. Of course, they didn't forget about our Commonwealth of Independent States partners. we know for sure that they regularly receive invitations which were ignored. And it is in fact the case that this so-called peace conference in Switzerland is falling apart. The Chinese are not going. Pakistan apparently is not going. South Africa is not going. It seems Brazil is not going. India is going to send low-level representatives. Apparently it's been confirmed that Prime Minister Modi, now re-elected, by the way, after this interminable Indian election. Anyway, he's not going. Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar also is not going. The world is staying away. The world, that is, outside the West and its immediate friends. I forgot to mention Saudi Arabia, apparently, according to the German media, is not going. So it's going to be down to President Zelensky and a few of his friends, and President Biden, it seems, definitely is not going. And the United States is going to be represented at this conference by that consummate diplomat and charismatic personality, Vice President Kamala Harris. So, well, isn't it time some real thinking was done? Some people finally thought about the situation and looked for a genuine way out. Now, the Financial Times has a huge article about the situation in Germany. And the article is entitled, "Germany's Fractious Coalition Dithers as the Heat Rises in Europe." And what's provoked this article are fears, when I say fears amongst the neoliberal establishment in Europe that there's going to be a populist breakthrough in the European Parliament elections. Perhaps there is, perhaps there won't be. We'll just have to wait and see. But anyway, that is apparently what is now uniting them in alarm. And, they might be right to be alarmed. But anyway, the article tells us that the war in Ukraine has swung in favor of Russia. Europe's economy limps behind the US. That is an interpretation, because I don't think the real underlying state of the US economy is particularly healthy, but I'm not going to discuss that now. The immigration question looms on the southern border. The far right is surging. To avoid falling off a cliff in 2026, Ukraine's much-hailed Green Deal needs refunding. And then we're told that President Macron has made a recent speech in which he has spoken about the real possibility that Europe might die, or at least President Macron's vision of Europe might die. Some people might think that would be a good thing, but again, I'm not going to get into a discussion about that either. But then we're told about the fact that there is, in fact, no real plan or idea for the way forward. The article speaks about the 3 days of the Franco-German summit this week, and all that came out was a limp joint statement. The two countries' leaders evoked sovereignty, but delivered none of its substance. Their main buzzwords, competitiveness and capital markets union, are the well-worn boilerplate of EU communiques. This is from the Financial Times. The emphasis on competitiveness is a reflex of the daunting geo-economic environment. Promising capital markets union sidesteps the question of common European borrowing. And then the article in the Financial Times says that it's all the fault of the Germans. Germany dragged its feet on Europe before because it once felt strong. This is always wrong-headed. Germany, too, has paid a price for the disastrous mishandling of the Eurozone crisis. That is true, by the way. And it says that now, however, such complacency is even more out of place. Germany is in a bad shape. Germany's energy policy is in disarray. We're not told why. That it's all down to the fact that Germany has cut itself off from Russian gas. But anyway, that's what we're told. Germany's fabled manufacturing sector faces an uncertain future. Again, cutting the country off from Russian gas might have some part to play in this, but again, the article doesn't tell us anything about that. It says that the German government is stalling in the face of all of this. It is not a sign of complacency, but of paralysis, which is true. And then we're told that there's an argument between Christian Lindner, the German finance minister from the FDP. He wants cuts in defense spending because of the budgetary crisis that is looming on the horizon. Unsurprisingly, this has encountered opposition from the extremely hawkish and aggressive German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, who clearly has ambitions one day to replace Olaf Scholz. And we're then told that even the Greens might be in difficulty. Scholz left it to the Greens to dynamite his coalition. Dynamite the coalition might be actually a more correct description of what did in fact happen. But then the article goes on to say savage backlash on the energy transition and agriculture has turned the environmentalists into scapegoats of the nation. And the hostile fire has not just come from the tabloid Bild Zeitung, but within Scholz's coalition and specifically from the Free Democrats. So everybody in Germany is quarrelling with everybody else, and it seems that there is no one able to take over. And we're told that Scholz would risk political survival if he were to try to strong-arm Lindner, the finance minister, for Europe's sake. It's always Europe. If it comes to an election, what is the alternative? Friedrich Merz, the CDU's leader, whose party tops opinion polls, prefers the role of divisive polemicist to that of constructive opposition leader. The reality, of course, is that the Germans are dancing around the catastrophic decisions that they took in 2022. The waging of the economic war against Russia has proved to be a disaster for them. And the same is true for other countries. Now, there's been a fascinating article about the situation in Italy, and it is by Conor Gallagher in Naked Capitalism, one of the most outstanding publications discussing the overall situation in Europe and indeed in the world generally. And it tells us that Italy, former Prime Minister Mario Draghi, the technocrat Prime Minister who was running Italy before, that he had gambled on turning Italy into a gas hub, that this had required forging a close relationship with the Russians, because that's where the gas ultimately was going to come from. Then, of course, the economic war began against Russia. The article doesn't say this, but I remember this very well, when it became clear that the economic war was not going to succeed, Draghi stepped down. Eventually, a new government led by Giorgia Meloni took over. And the new Italian government has continued with the policy of creating the gas hub. And they've been hunting around for alternative sources of gas in Algeria, in Africa, in all sorts of places. But in practice, the gas continues to come, some of it via Austria. And if you look and source it, it comes ultimately from Gazprom, from Russia's big gas export monopoly. And the Russians, of course, ever since 2022, have been insisting on payment in rubles for any gas that they export to Europe. And it looks as if the Austrian companies buying this gas are indeed paying for it in rubles, and by extension so is Italy. And the Italians have committed themselves to moving away from Russian gas by the start of next year. But long before they're ready, it seems that there's been a court decision in some undisclosed country, perhaps Germany, perhaps Austria, that requires exclusive payment for gas to be made in euros, which means, in effect, that this gas from Gazprom, the supply of it is going to stop. And all of this is happening even as it turns out that the expected imports of gas from all of these other places, from Algeria, from Mozambique, from all sorts of places, is falling short of expectations. And the article suggests that that might mean a further 18% rise in gas prices. And it also points out that despite all of the talk that I've been hearing of a stabilizing economic situation in Italy, the reality is that there have been several months now of industrial contraction. In other words, Italy's manufacturing sector, which is a core part of Italy's economy, is in recession. Italy, by the way, is the second biggest industrial power in the EU after Germany. It has a very significant industrial base. As I understand, it has contracted, however, significantly since Italy joined the euro. It looks as if this contraction is continuing. And the article correctly points out that Italian public opinion is now openly sceptical of the economic war. Business opinion also. The Italian government is becoming unhappy with many of the recent moves. It's spoken flatly out against the use of Western weapons in strikes against Russia. By the way, the Netherlands and Belgium have also said that recently, have just said that Ukraine cannot use any F-16s that they supply to carry out missile strikes against Russia. Remember that Putin has warned countries with dense populations in Europe about the dangers they might run if the Russians launch counterstrikes against them. Belgium and the Netherlands have amongst the densest, the highest population densities in Europe. Just saying. But anyway, returning to Italy, the Italians have been pushing back a little. But what do they actually propose to do? Well, the Meloni government is apparently decided that it's going to supply another SAMP-T anti-aircraft system to Ukraine. Italy once had 3. It's already given 1 to Ukraine. It's going to now supply another. It's going to be left with only 1. The whole thing is beyond understanding. The situation that Europe finds itself in, apparently hostages to a policy that is failing, is beyond comprehension. This is the continent that produced so many titans in its history, political titans, Napoleon, Bismarck, Julius Caesar, Charlemagne, you name them. And apparently none of them, no leader today, is able to change course. Well, there it is. It does look like the death of Europe. But contrary to what Macron is saying, it seems to me that the European leadership, himself included, far from being the saviours, are in truth the gravediggers instead. Well, this is where I finish my programme today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also find our support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop where we have a discount and a whole new range for Football 24, which is oncoming. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.